Good morning and welcome to the first board meeting of the Medicine and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency for 2024, or the MHRA as we prefer to call ourselves. My name is Graham Cook and I'm the interim co-chair of the MHRA alongside Mandy Calvert and Michael Whitehouse, and my role is to lead us through today's agenda. For those who've not attended board before, I must start by reminding people this is a board in public and not a public meeting. And it's also important to explain that the board is responsible for agreeing the strategic direction of the agency, maintaining high standards of corporate governance and scrutinising the performance of the MHRA. But it's also important to clarify that this board does not make regulatory decisions on any medicines or medical devices. This is because regulatory decisions on individual medical products are made by ministers in the Department of Health and Social Care on the recommendation of MHRA officials, who are civil servants, with the independent advice of our expert advisory committees, such as the Commission on Human Medicines. Now, as far as today's meeting is concerned, I also need to make you aware we'll be recording the meeting and we will publish the video on our websites along with previous meetings and provide the opportunity for as many people as possible to observe what the board does. On that note, I'm pleased to say we have 93 people registered to observe our meeting, more than we've had for the last few months, I think, and 69 of those are members of the public or representative of patient groups, 13 from industry, 9 members of staff. So thank you all for joining, and there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the meeting. With introductions in mind, I'd like to go around the room and ask my colleagues on the board to introduce themselves, starting with June.
Good morning, everyone. I'm June Rain. I'm the Chief Executive of the MHRA.
Good morning, I'm Natalie Richards, I'm the Head of the Executive Office.
Good morning, I'm Mark Bailey, the Chief Science and Innovation Officer.
Good morning, Claire Harrison, Chief Digital and Technology Officer.
Hello, I'm Liz Booth, I'm Chief People Officer.
Good morning, I'm Mandy Calvert, Non-Exec Director and Interim Co-Chair.
Hello, Catherine Glover, Deputy Director for Medicines Regulation and Prescribing at the Department of Health and Social Care.
Hello, I'm Michael Whitehouse, Non-Executive Director and another Co-Interim Chair.
Good morning, I'm Rose Braithwaite, Chief Finance Officer.
Good morning, Paul Goldsmith, Non-Exec.
Good morning, Mercy Jersingham, Non-Executive Director.
Good morning, Julian Beach, Interim Executive Director for Healthcare Quality and Access.
Good morning, Junaid Bajwa, Non-Exec Director.
Good morning, Raj Long, Non-Exec Director.
Good morning, I'm Glenn Wells, the Chief Partnerships Officer.
Good morning, I'm Rachel Bosworth, I'm Director of Communications and Engagement.
Good morning, Carly McGurry, Director of Governance, MHRA.
Thank you, everyone. So everybody should have access to the board pack for today's meeting, and we'll use the page numbers in the pack to keep on track. We'll assume that everybody here has read the papers, and we'll spend most of our time on discussion. Although this is not a public meeting, we do provide an opportunity for members of the public to ask board questions about the items on the agenda. And when we've finished our discussions, we'll have a session at the end where we'll take those questions. Please put those in the chat function. But members of the public should be aware the board cannot see the comments in the chat function, and this is used by our communications team to identify questions that are relevant to the agenda that we'll address at the end. So if you want to ask a question not related to today's board papers, please do not use the chat function and contact our Customer Experience Centre, who'll be able to help you. Similarly, please do not make any personal abusive comments in the chat function. You won't be able to get a response and you may be removed from the meeting, as we do not tolerate any form of abuse or harassment directed towards our staff or our board members by individual members of the public. So that's all I have to say by way of introduction. Is there anything else people would like to highlight? Otherwise, we'll move to our papers. And in the first instance, we have a couple of apologies this morning. So Alison Cave, our Chief Safety Officer, is not joining us today, and Haida Hussain, Non-Executive Director, is unable to join us today. We have, in addition, online, I think perhaps, are we expecting Greg Chalmers?
Unwell, he sent apologies.
He sent his apologies as well. Okay. And we have apologies from Alison Strath and Cathy Harrison in Scotland and Northern Ireland, respectively. In that case, we move to look at the conflicts of interest. I think you have those in front of you. Is there anything new that people would like to update in relation to declarations of interest? Okay. In that case, we'll move on to our minutes of the previous meeting that we have on page just get that right. Item 3, we have the minutes of the previous meeting. Mercy, do you want to comment on something?
Yes, I've got an amendment. I was in attendance, so...
You were in attendance?
I was in attendance, but I'm not listed.
Okay. And the only action I was going to note on there's an action that was for you in terms of the PSEC committee that we won't capture on the action tracker, to review the electronic patient information leaflet. So is that a part of a future PSEC?
Yes, we're going to put that on the forward plan.
Okay. I think all the other actions from the minutes are captured in the action tracker. Is there any other comments on the minutes? Doesn't look like it, in which case we'll accept those as an accurate record of the previous meeting. And we'll move on to the action tracker. There are a number of things arising that will be coming forward for future meetings. I think on today's agenda we've got a number of things. So we've got an update from Mark on the clinical trials work, which we'll hear later, and a few things that are scheduled for March, which we might look at when we come to the board planning agenda later on. Anything else to highlight, Carly, on the action tracker?
No, I don't think so. Not for today.
Great. Any other comments from anyone? Okay. In that case, I think we'll move on to June's report from the last month. June, thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Graham. And I know colleagues will have read the report, but as ever, just to stress how busy it has been for the agency, a lot in this report. But also I might just highlight new year, new beginnings. There's been some new things on the horizon since particularly the beginning of this month. And of course, the key themes are always enabling access to healthcare products safely, to support science and innovation, and most importantly, to deliver for patients. So in terms of enabling access, I really would like to flag that momentous date of the 1st of January when our international recognition procedure became law. And we look at this really very positively. We'll be talking about it shortly in terms of harnessing the expertise of regulatory partners worldwide to enable that smooth and streamlined access to innovation. But of course, we've got to consider and debate at the board here what our, if you like, USP is going forward. So I know that will be a good discussion, but just wanted to highlight the importance of the 1st of January. We're also looking at new assessment approaches for our established medicines. That's been something that we've been discussing for a little while, but with the need to improve efficiency and eliminate backlogs, our teams in established medicines have really been putting their thoughts together on how to make this as effective as possible. And I know that later we'll be talking about that too. The 9th of January was a special date because we published our long-awaited roadmap for medtech, and that has been really warmly welcomed because at long last, huge, massive piece of work, equivalent to a bill, I think. It's such a big piece of work. We're able to begin to show the way forward, and that will matter for software, AI, diagnostics, some of the important technologies. So I just wanted to highlight what's new. I think it's important too to talk about, as a result of the McLean report last week, what we're doing to improve access to transformative products, particularly with the devices pathway, IDAP, looking at some really front runners, the 8 out of about 80 applicants that we'll be pushing forward by 2025. And that's got patient expert input as well. And I think a good example of the one agency approach I always look for is a medicine for arthritis called golimumab. You'll have seen it in here. It's coming off patent, but our scientists are looking at international standards. So the whole agency is helping to deliver for this important population. And I can't leave the science and innovation part without mentioning polio. The news is that the emergency use listing by the WHO, thanks to the intervention of the regulator in Indonesia, is now pre-qualified. And that's a really important step. The scientists who've done this work really are leading the field, and this makes it much more accessible. Finally, delivering for patients and the public, colleagues will have heard last week about the European agency's action on valproate, particularly the risk of fathers handing down neurodevelopmental disorders. That's a question that we're looking at. But importantly, our new measures come into place, and they're measures that have had the input of our valproate patients and stakeholders network to make sure that no one who can be treated with something else is actually started on valproate. So, and last of all, I think it's again back to science. The Group B strep support group came in and were treated to quite a lot of insights into what we as an agency are doing to eliminate this really nasty infection in newborns. None of it would be possible without our staff. I've talked a fair bit, I know, but the credit all goes to the staff who've been so committed throughout what's been quite a challenging time. So I'll stop there. It's just some highlights to really bring to life what I know is quite a long read.
No, thanks, Jean. And I think every board we comment on how much is going on, but it does seem even more than usual at this time. So I think it's a tremendous breadth of work. Comments or questions on anything? Mandy.
Yeah, thank you, Jean. There was a couple of questions, one on the Windsor framework and one on the criminal enforcement unit. I noticed on the Windsor framework that we're disapplying the Falsified Medicines Directive, and I wanted to understand what safeguards we have against falsified medicines in that case, and then how that relates to whether where we're seeing the bigger picture for medicines fraud. Now, we might pick this up in a future board agenda item, but just so we get a longer term view whether things are actually getting better, particularly over the past few years, or not. Because I thought there was an additional risk potentially with the FMD disapplication.
Should we take the Windsor framework question first?
Yes, and thank you for asking that. It's been a really intense piece of work led by our partnerships group largely, but with a lot of input from healthcare quality and access, really to make sure that we maximise the benefit of this important agreement, but also ensure access. Particularly, we're also in contact with the HPRA, the Irish agency. So there's wider ramifications. But I think to pay tribute appropriately to the work that's been done, I'd like to bring Glenn in, Chair, through you, if you would like to. On the latest state of play, I'd like to say smooth sailing, but there's a lot of peddling under the surface. Thank you.
Glenn. Just use your mic.
Sorry. I've just come back to you on the FMD front. So we've been focusing primarily at the moment on the FMD disapplication as part of the negotiation. So the work has to be worked through. But we have published the latest guidance on packaging. We're now having to review all guidance in the agency and make sure that it matches with the Windsor framework negotiations. And that's an ongoing process for the next few months. But we're also working closely with industry, working closely with Julian and his team on regular engagements. In fact, there is one tomorrow to update them on the Windsor framework as well. So it's been a process of rapidly adapting policy to the negotiation position, but also heavy stakeholder engagement to make sure whatever we do doesn't cause too much disruption to our sector.
Do you want to come back on that? So I think normally we'd ask Alison about the criminal enforcement. Does anyone want to talk about the trends there, or?
I think what the board should perhaps focus on, and we are coming up to have a more deep dive with the board, is the strategic change that rather than monitoring trends, we're looking at how the actions that we take, and that's what normally gets into my report. There's been a piece of really important action, actually feed into a change in those trends. So I know Andy Morling would really like to come and talk through how the strategic approach, which, it's easy to say disincentive, but there's a huge educational value. His linkages with other enforcement agencies worldwide are really helping us to change the gear on this. But I think what's important for our minutes is the way, if I can say, you've linked the FMD aspects, and counterfeit is a huge part of this with the enforcement strategy. So what I'd like to suggest, Chair, is that we come back in the light of Windsor and FMD to what that enforcement strategy looks like. It's a particularly evil crime, counterfeit, and we need to protect our patients, our public, and I want there to be complete confidence that it's one aspect of the agency that never sleeps.
and I think with some of the supply issues at the moment, it's likely to be a major issue for a while. Claire?
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, Andy and Alison, when she's back, will talk more about it, but we're doing quite a lot of work with new technology as well, so online and the more physical aspects of it as well, so there's a lot underway.
Okay, great. Michael, did you want to come in on that?
I've got a separate question.
Andy, you happy?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's important to link them together rather than seeing in isolation. Thanks.
Helpful. Michael?
Just two questions, me. One external and one internal. The external one is that, June, you make reference in the paper to the increase in the number of approved bodies for medical devices. Have we got a view on what capacity we need out there to ensure that, that we can meet industry's needs for patients? How many approved bodies do we need? That's my first question, and then I'll come on to my second one.
The capacity of the system is being looked at in an ongoing way as the roadmap develops. And I think that what is really interesting is the expertise that the approved bodies will need as we look at these exciting new developments, particularly in the area of software, AI, etc., diagnostics. So you're right that the pump priming with 2 new approved bodies is really important, but we need to think more broadly. And I would suggest that we also need to think internationally. We know that particularly through our Access, Australia, Canada, Singapore, Switzerland consortium, that there are perhaps untapped areas of expertise. But it's not so much, if you like, how many people work for an approved body and what their throughput is. I do think the expertise is going to be particularly important to us. It'll be an ongoing discussion.
Okay. Thank you. That seems to me something that we should continue to monitor as a board. My internal question really relates to the civil service review, the staff survey results, which seem encouraging with the level of engagement. But I was interested in the point about improving confidence in and transparency of leadership decision making. What is the extent of the issue there?
Can you just point to the paragraph?
Yes, sorry, it's paragraph 6.2. It's the third bullet. I don't know if Liz wanted to add. What is the extent of the issue that people are concerned about within the organisation, and what is the work that we're proposing to do to address that?
I'll offer a perspective. I know Liz Booth, our Chief People Officer, will want to, and I'm sure possibly Mandy as well for our one agency leadership group that was kindly led by Mandy. I'd take it back to some of the massive changes we've gone through, bedding in new teams, and our own ability. I think one of the phrases that's sometimes used, fix it while you fly. There's a lot of work going on. Managers' time is very, very pressurised, but the feeling that staff want to engage in decision making is extremely welcome.
Yes.
What we've been doing, particularly through a huge step forward, our shadow executive, is co-deciding on where we can actually have that level of involvement. One example of that is a clear question from our all-staff meeting about the way that our changes have accrued benefits, not just financial, but other benefits, is now being looked at in a co-design way with our shadow executive. So I think this is a natural, possibly a growing, if you like, area that we need to work on. We would have needed to work on it anyway, but I do think that the changes we've gone through have catalysed this. And not only have we had our one agency leadership group on this, but I know Liz would like to offer some observations too. So I'll stop there, Chair, but it's a sort of, again, a journey that we're on.
Liz or Mandy, do you want?
The reason we've picked this out as a particular issue is a number of questions that we asked colleagues as part of the People Survey. And I would say first that all of the answers to the questions are a huge improvement on last year.
Yes,
We're looking
yes,
at 15%
I acknowledge that,
improvements, those kinds of things. But should the MHRA be less successful than the wider civil service in questions like, I feel involved in the decisions that affect my work. I feel my organisation keeps me well informed about matters that affect me. I have confidence in the way change is managed. These are areas where we've made massive leaps, but we're also in those sorts of questions around about 10 percentage points short of a typical civil service organisation.
That's interesting.
So what we're looking at in the people survey is not the areas that we've failed to improve in. Of course, we're looking at those, but we're comparing ourselves to other civil service bodies, and we're asking, are we comfortable that the MHRA should be falling behind the typical civil service body? And in this area, in confidence and in transparency of decision making, we think we're not as good as we need to be.
Okay.
In terms of how we're addressing it, talking with colleagues, a myriad of things, everything from the most simple thing like making sure that minutes of meetings get published on our intranet so people can see them, to providing more opportunities for colleagues to ask questions, to engage with us, more of a two-way communication from our colleagues really, and we're hoping that a combination of these various ways forward will help to improve us to beyond the civil service typical actually. And I know that the board wants to rightly have a deep dive into the results of the people survey, and it's something I'm very much looking forward to.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to come in on that, Raj? Just on that, Mandy, or?
Yeah, I think it's something we've discussed at ODRC, our leadership capability, and I think we have moved forward. But certainly some of our projects and our performance isn't where we need to be, and leadership is a key part of that, as is clear governance and roles and responsibility. So I think working on all of those things, the HR leadership capability, the processes, the way we do things, but also our tools that support that. So some of those things all need to come together, which is really important. But communication, internal communication has come up several times when we've done reviews of Regulatory Collect and one thing and another. So it is really important that that message gets through. And the step forward was the leadership meeting, the 100 leaders. But quite interestingly, many of those people hadn't met each other before, which I was quite surprised at. But there was an enthusiasm. So I think the will is there. We have to respond to that.
Rachel, do you want to comment on anything in terms of the internal engagement, or?
Well, just to say that following the results of the People Survey, we're developing a new employee engagement strategy, which is an update to previous versions, and to share that we're planning to bring all our managers together towards the end of March, again for a face-to-face session, because we've had a number of new people and we know that many may not have met each other in person. So that's the next stage, and then we'll be repeating the kind of leadership event probably around May, again to keep that linked going and keep that connection.
Okay, so it's some important progress, but still more to do and some areas to highlight, which is helpful, I think. Just one more, and then we'll move on. Raj?
Thank you, Chair. The question is really a little bit of insight in terms of June on the agency priorities, item 8.5, where current priorities are going to be creating centres of excellence of regulatory science and innovation. Would you be able to give some insight, given the very broad basis of the agency on all the different areas we work in? Is there any particular area that you've been thinking about around in terms of targeting? I'm just curious more than, I think it's firstly, let me say it's a fantastic idea, because I think timing is good because of where we are.
So maybe ask Jean to start, and then perhaps Glenn.
And Glenn will come in. Yes, it's a great question, and in a sense, it's probably better for me to say our minds are open at this moment. There's so much that's relevant to regulatory decision making happening in the world of science and technology that the moving parts are our stable science strategy and our network of centres of excellence for regulatory science and innovation. And so I think at this moment, while our call is still open, it's better for me, it's better for everyone if I say our minds are open, because out there may be a group that's doing something that says we can see a direct relevance from our regulatory or science that is relevant to regulation that we think should be part of this network. What we want to do is actually compare, particularly with the US where this works well, and any other regulators. I was asking the European regulators just recently how well their regulatory science initiative works. We want the best regulatory decisions on benefit and risk and strategic decisions for the public and for healthcare. And I think at this stage, but it will move rather fast, it's not to be evasive, because I think we all know some of the things, we're talking about them all the time, but I want to keep our minds open, because there could just be, I mean, if you wind back 3 years or 4 years, who'd heard of mRNA vaccines? Who had heard of AI transforming hospital management systems that impact on patient decisions? You know, the world has moved very fast. So I'm being a bit evasive, but I'm saying our minds are open. I think we'll keep this as a running agenda item, actually.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Glenn, do you want to talk a bit? So the call is open for CERSIs and MHRA is contributing to the funding. So do you want to just sort of talk about how that's going to work?
Sure. So the call is open 13th of December, and they're under the titles of the Regulatory Science Innovation Networks, working with Innovate UK as our partner. Also OLS. I won't go into the numbers behind it, but happy to share those with you. We have indicated in that call, it's part of a much larger call for those networks. There are only one sector they're interested in because obviously their portfolio is broader than health and life sciences. Those networks we are going to provide in this implementation phase up to 50k per network for us to shape the conversation with them. So on the 25th of this month, there will be a webinar which will give us the opportunity to talk to potential applicants to explain what we're interested in. We have published a list. It matches our corporate plan. It's been increased by OLS, but as Jean said, it's definitely a list which is not prescriptive. It's an areas we might be interested in. But again, we're hoping to pull on UK academia to tell us where the innovations are that we can't address internally. So we have to be open-minded. We shouldn't bias the competition in any way by any conversations that we have. Call closes 31st of January, and then there's a process going there to shortlist, choose applicants, and then work with them very closely over the coming months on their fuller applications for the CERSIs themselves. I think from my experience of funding into UK innovation sector, I'd say the model is probably about networks rather than the US big drop of money into one single institution. But let's see what we get. That's the exciting thing about these competitions. You don't know till they come in.
Does that answer your question, Raj?
Yes, in part, but just something for consideration. Given you've said it's open, is to also look to see what pockets of interest are also occurring globally, because then your ability to go further would increase.
Yeah. I mean, there's an interesting distinction, isn't there, between wanting to be differentiated and do something that's not being done, and also linking to those centres that have excellence, which is applicable everywhere, I guess.
Yeah. I'm thinking co-creation, co-work, thinking in that spirit. Just there are some opportunities there, I think, that would take us further.
Surely,
faster.
And I wouldn't want to give the impression that we're forever hunting the latest or newest thing. I think, particularly when we think about our own assets, the real world data is by no means a story that's, stable where it needs to be. I think we can go a very great deal further to benefit regulation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the CERSIs are very exciting, and there's an interesting sort of distinction between the internal capabilities that we have and the science agenda there, but also leveraging the science outside that is not our core capability, but we need. And I think that would be interesting to see how that develops. Great, thank you, June. That's broad and comprehensive as ever. We'll move on to item 5 in that case, which is the Finance and HR report for MHRA. So, Rose, do you want to introduce the paper, and over to you.
Thank you very much. So this report shows our financial position at the end of November. Overall, we're forecasting to finish the financial year with a £4.4 million surplus. And this is driven both by trading income being above our budget, staff costs being slightly below our budget, and also we're catching up on our operating cost spend. I think it's clear that although we're behind year to date, around 7% underspent against our budget. We are going to catch up with a 2% overspend by the end of the year. The agency's change costs are still behind the curve, with a year-to-date underspend of 46%. But again, we're forecasting to catch up significantly in the final 4 months of the year to deliver within 4% of our budgeted change costs. Capital spend is slightly improved in November, but we are still behind our planned spend. But I would say that our regulatory management system, or Regulatory Connect, as it is now, is storming ahead in terms of its spend, and now spending £1.54 million a month. And we're more behind on our spend at our capital spend at South Mims. But we know from experience that we tend to catch up in the final quarter of the year on our capital spend at South Mims. So we do anticipate spending all of our capital expenditure as planned for the rest of the year. The final thing to say is we are looking at whether we can spend that anticipated surplus of just over 4 million, and are looking at all options to spend it, particularly where we have backlogs of work in the organisation. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Rose. Comments, questions? Michael.
Question. Rose and I have talked about this extensively, but I will ask the one question, Rose. You're confident about increasing spend, but does that mean that you know that formal contractual commitments or people will come into the organisation? That's the sort of assurance I'd be looking for. Is that the case?
Yes. So in particular, we approved an additional £2.9 million worth of additional spend. I think it was in month 5, and we are tracking that through the Resources Committee, both ensuring that the contracts are signed and that the contracts are signed and the people are in the organisation. So yes, we are tracking that spend and ensuring that it's occurring.
Okay, and the only other, so I'm assured by that, but one comment I will make, and again, Rose and I have discussed this, it is interesting in light of some of the performance issues that the agency has faced around clinical trials and established medicines. I do wonder going forward whether our financial reporting should be a bit more focused on performance against statutory functions and the level of resource that is going in. I think that would give the board more assurance that those areas are appropriately resourced, and where sometimes you have to move resources from one part of the organisation to the other, it might be a bit more transparent. I know Rose is looking at that going forward, but I would think it would strengthen the scrutiny that this board has over the achievement of the agency's key priorities.
And can you help us understand when that would happen? So would that be part of the planning for next financial year?
So we are bringing revised performance measures to the board next month for you to look at and decide whether they are sufficient or we need more changes. So you will see a new set of performance measures next month.
And the budget will be structured in a different way, or?
So we will have a look at that and how we do that. That would have to wait till next year. We're currently looking at the budget for approval in March. So we will look at how we present that to the board in March.
Does anyone else have comments on that structuring and experience that might be relevant? No. Okay. Mandy, different. Is that so? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be very helpful, at least to make some linkage. So, just as a little, for example, so we're going to probably struggle to spend the capital on South Mims. We've had some health and safety issues which have cited old kit as a reason. We could then begin to link those things together, so we understand a little bit more how our spend is actually affecting our performance, and that's obviously a statutory responsibility. And so I think in that case, and I don't know how business cases are worked up, but that could give a much greater visibility, particularly to the non-execs who aren't living this all the time, so that we understand the resourcing requirements for meeting our statutory obligations in licensing and clinical trials with health and safety, and then new initiatives as they come through.
It's what struck me as well. So health quality access, for instance, is performing well to budget, is under budget, but obviously we have issues about performance. So I think that link would be really useful, as Mandy was saying.
And I think some of that surplus is actually the backlog fees, isn't it? So that's not going to be there necessarily going forward. So Rose, so is that something that you're looking at doing, or is that something that needs more discussion? Or
I think it needs more work, and it may not be something that we would report on a regular basis. It may be better doing deep dives into the different areas to provide you with the assurance, rather than doing monthly or quarterly reporting on how the finances link up. So, for instance, I think you'll see in 2 of the papers direct references to fees and how we are proposing to recover the higher cost of delivering an improved performance. So you're right, there is that very close linkage, but I don't think that will come clearly through using a finance approach. I think it's far better maybe to show that deep dive of how we're resourcing to the workload and how that is being funded to give you clear assurance that we're thinking about those things. So let me take that away and suggest a best approach for you.
Michael, do you want to come back on that? Do you think that?
Yeah, the general principle, and that's why I was a little bit hesitant, because I understand the difficulties with this, but I do think one is always looking back and thinking about, did we get governance right in this place? I find it a bit strange as an organisation that we do not have greater transparency about performance against our statutory functions. And that's key to what this board is about, being able to give assurance that we are dealing and meeting all those statutory functions within the timetables determined by Parliament. So I think there is something about getting better information. I'd leave it to Rose and the executive team to think that through, but I think that would strengthen.
But being clear how it all aligns through to those statutory functions. Joan?
Well, I'd like to offer assurance that we're doing this quite urgently. This isn't something that's waiting. We have been publishing performance against statutory targets for clinical trials and established medicines, but you'll see what went out yesterday, or I think it was yesterday or today, is much clearer on the percentage of approvals or determinations that are meeting statute. And that has got to be the guide that we use, underpinned by, of course, standards and expectations that are clear to staff. So we can't, if you like, get away from the fact that some of these high volume throughput areas, like clinical trials, need a different gearing. And in that case, it was notification, as we'll talk about. So we need to be able to demonstrate that we meet the statutory requirement and do it in a very intelligent way, rather than just throwing more money in directions. So individual staff will come into the world of being very, very clear about expectations and standards. And, we look to all our executive, including HR, of course, to be very supportive of this change. It didn't matter in the days of Europe, but now it does as a sovereign regulator.
A couple of questions, but Catherine, from the department point of view, do you have any comment on how the finances are presented or structured? Sorry, just with the mic.
Sorry. I think it needs to work for the board and operationally, and I think it's right to try different ways of doing that. The accounting rules for the department, as you know, Rose, have its own requirements on presentation. My only hesitation is that some of the teams are agile and work across different statutory functions, so there's just something about how you might account for that. But I'm sure you will find a way.
Okay, I think a couple of questions, Paul, and did you want to come in, Raj? Yeah, Paul and Raj.
Yeah, maybe it's sort of people have been here a lot longer than me, but have we ever not had a significant underspend? And how did the other arm's length bodies perform? Do they all systematically underspend as well?
So can I? So the target the Treasury gives everyone is to be within 1% of their funding. It is obviously quite difficult for us because we're a demand-led organisation So we have to estimate what our fees are going to be in any one year. So that 1% is quite hard for us because we don't know precisely what our fees are going to be at the beginning of each year. Because in the past we have significantly underspent as well, but as a trading fund, we could keep that money to reinvest in our future. But now, as an agency, we can't do that. So our ambition is to spend as close to our income, both our fees and our grant and aid from the department, as possible.
And Paul was asking about relative performance of ALBs, I think.
I might hand that over to DHSC.
I don't have the figures to hand, but there is variance. Some overspend, some underspend, but as Rose said, the target is for them all to come in on the nail. That is harder for some organisations than others, depending on the predictability of both income and spend.
Because I'm sort of trying to understand, is this sort of a structural problem external to MHRA, or is it an internal challenge?
I mean, for what it's worth, I recall a year ago having the conversation about capital spend at South Mims being behind track, and it was going to be on track. So I'd like a bit more assurance that that's going to be.
If I draw on my previous experience, which is, involved as an external auditor of government departments, which is a bit outdated now, I would say generally across the public sector, there's optimism bias and people underspend. The only challenge I'd give back to Rose, having to run a budget where you are trying to come within 1%, we need to take that seriously. That's really around being good at estimating demand, and it's not beyond the will of most people now to be able to get that right in terms of going forward. So I would say that's a challenge for this organisation. As you deal with the backlog, we know broadly what demand is coming forward. We need to manage that demand a bit better. And that's the way in which you begin to get closer to your 1%. It's a challenge for most government departments, but it's a challenge that industry have as well. And it can be done, and that's I think we ought to come back to that without putting poor June and Rose under undue pressure. I think it's a good challenge to take.
Thank you, Michael. I completely agree. We're doing a lot of work on our fee modelling to include volumes, so that we can be as precise as we can in terms of the income. So, as you say, we can aim for that 1%.
Paul, come back.
And I think to help with that would be if we, from a presentational perspective, had more longitudinal presentation rather than the cross-sectional that we have at the moment.
Raj. Sorry. Raj.
Thank you, Chair. Have we got any insight why the CPRD income is decreasing? And the reason I'm asking that is fees fluctuate, as we know, but CPRD is one of our important assets, and it'll be good to understand if there's anything happening there that we should be taking note of.
Yeah, I think I've raised this, and I think that, Rose, do you want to?
I don't have anything precisely with me at the moment, but I can come back.
And Alison is not here, but we can ask Alison. Yeah,
I think some of the predicted areas, the pragmatic trials and sprint service for recruitment, haven't been operationalised in the way that we'd expected. That doesn't directly answer your question. There's been quite a change around to get to secure data environment, and a bit of a pause on getting data from the NHS that links. So there's probably a number of factors in this that we'll be coming to the board with.
But just to check, you were looking at the reserve funding, I think. And I think I got confused by that myself. So
apologies. Yes. So the reserve funding is so that amount is money that's come. We're allowed to. It's essentially a prepayment that we've had for CPRD, which we can spend over the next 10 years. So we have allocated it based on the CPRD's team's expectation of how much they want to spend in change for resource spending rather than capital. So that's up to us how much we allocate and use each year from the reserves.
So there's another item on page 7. I don't know which one you were referring to, but maybe that's helpful. Okay. Julian, do you want to?
Yeah, just to comment on looking at the more of a strategic view in terms of the pipeline. We are looking at having and have initiated having conversations with companies from an application point of view to understand what their profile is over the next 2 to 5 years, so that we can accurately predict more than we have been in terms of the demand. And so that will then drive the capability that we will require within the agency in certain evolving trends where guidance is being either we're performing it, we're generating it, or we're then seeing applications come in against it. So that's kind of like from both an inspection and from a licensing application perspective going forward. And so indeed we had one very fruitful discussion with a company yesterday, which was looking at in 5 different therapeutic areas, which was very much appreciated.
Andy?
Yeah, just it was going back to Michael's point about the 1% is very tight. With our projects where we're making in the RDL rather than capital projects, always are subject to some fluctuation, and each year we get to this period and think, are we going to spend that? I mean, it might be useful for the board to see where the portfolio of programmes are and which ones we're elevating up or taking down, because you can never predict exactly what's going to go through. But if we've got a portfolio, we can see what we're doing, because some of those projects don't go away, they just get deferred into next year, which can be quite problematic. And I think understanding what's stopping programmes going forward would be actually quite useful insight for the board to understand, so that we see where the resources are. I don't know, Michael.
I think that's very sensible.
Rose, do you want to comment on?
So we can certainly provide that, yes.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? No? Okay. Well, Rose, hopefully there's some useful feedback there. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to highlight before we move on.
No, that's great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Okay, let's move on in that case to item 6, which is in relation to clinical trials. So how effectively is the MHRA maintaining performance on clinical trials? And we've just heard a bit about the relevance of that. And related to that, how are the plans for the new regulatory system progressing? So Mark, I think this is in your name, but I think, James, you've joined us for this one. So thank you for coming. Do you want to just briefly introduce yourself for the online audience, and then we'll go?
So good morning, I'm James Pound, Deputy Director for Standards and Compliance at MHRA, and I've been supporting the work of clinical trials within the agency for the past 6 months.
Thanks. Mark, are you going to introduce? And then...
Yes, very happy to, Chair. So we know that clinical trials has been through a difficult period, but we're through, and I'm very pleased to say that we are meeting and exceeding our statutory limits on initials and amendments. However, the quick question is, are we sustainable? And sustainability is not achieved by a very simple measure. There's a lot of different parts in play which have to be pulled off to ensure that legislation is in place, the regulatory operational model in place, international alignment, meeting government requirements such as a Lord O'Shaughnessy. So it's quite a significant project of reform going on. James and the team have been working very hard on all aspects of this, and at this point I'll hand over to James to talk through the paper.
Thanks, James.
Thank you very much, Mark. So the paper initially sets out the performance of the organisation in terms of clinical trials, and there are no backlogs that exist for clinical trial applications, either for initials or amendments, and we continue to perform as we have since September for newly received applications well within the statutory timeframes which are set out in section 3. We are retaining some of the measures that we adopted over the course of the summer to resolve the backlog to maintain performance. However, we'll be gradually reducing those as we onboard additional staff to support the assessment of clinical trials, in particular for the clinical, non-clinical and pharmaceutical assessment. That leaves us with setting out the future of the regulation of clinical trials at the MHRA in the UK, and that is where the bulk of this paper focuses. In section 5, we talk about the vision around risk proportionate assessment, the focus on patients, working with partners across the healthcare system in the UK, making the UK an attractive destination internationally for clinical trials, and supporting the use of innovative trial design and novel technologies, very much in line with the government response to the consultation on the clinical trials regulations. And this model then further takes on board the innovations and learnings that we adopted over the summer as we resolved that backlog. Very much making sure that we focus where risk is greatest embedding risk proportionality, be it for assessment across the disciplines or inspections, and enabling us to refocus resource to support and enable innovation upstream, and to ensure that we maintain trials through the different phases within the UK and to the benefit of patients and the life sciences ecosystem. In section 6, we talk through the important focus on the balance between the assessment and notification of clinical trials, bearing in mind the importance of those trials where we need a clear and prompt assessment by our assessors, but those where we can adopt a notification scheme building on that we launched in October of last year, and that we'll be holding a workshop on 29th of January, the King's Fund, to further develop those criteria with a view to expanding our notification scheme for the safe benefit of patients and for those undertaking the relevant clinical trials. And the capacity data that sits later in the paper is very much modelled on some percentages that have been developed in some of the workshops we held towards the end of last year with stakeholders. However, those will be validated at that workshop on the 29th of January. We also talk in the paper around a new approach around the clinical trials lifecycle package. And this is where we want to build support in from the very outset of trial design, starting with early phase 1 and first in human trials, as we go through those different phases to 2, 3 and 4, as well as for the amendments that would be put in place during the progression through those trial phases, making sure that that's something that helps anchor those trials in the UK. However, there will be trials that may not necessarily be going through that multi-phase approach, and we certainly want to continue to support upstream scientific advice for those novel trial designs and where there is novel technology perhaps being implemented as part of that clinical trial application. Both of those working to accelerate approval once it gets to the right point for approval, but also to importantly reduce grounds for non-approval by making sure we're working upstream to avoid issues occurring later on, be it through assessment or through downstream inspections. The paper addresses how these proposals will meet the ambitions of Lord O'Shaughnessy's review for commercial clinical trials in terms of approval and the 60-day turnaround time ambition across ourselves and obviously the combined review with HRA, and also how it meets the ambitions of the life sciences vision, again in terms of those important therapeutic areas of focus set out in the life sciences vision, and supporting the clinical research in the UK. In terms of international collaboration, we touch on the important work through international fora, such as the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, where we work in partnership with others to develop steering reflection papers and strategic views on emerging areas and topics related to clinical trials, be it decentralized trials or diversity and inclusion, but also the important partnerships we have through, for example, the Access Consortium to collaborate and work together potentially in the future around the assessment and scientific advice for clinical trials. The capacity and capability model has been developed in detail by the team, and that's predicated on some of those earlier numbers that I talk about in the paper in relation to the split between notification and assessment. And we'll be working those into the budget planning process for financial year 24-25, and obviously validating those criteria and challenging them at the workshop we're holding on the 29th. We identify some of those key areas, again, aligned with the life sciences vision as well as the agency's science strategy, where we need to upskill and develop the capabilities of our team to support that clinical trial lifecycle package approach, but also the upstream scientific advice. And then in terms of the legislation, if you look at the annex, there are some provisional timelines set out at the annex at the end, looking to lay the SI later this year, but then with a phased implementation of the regulations, front-loading activity related to assessment notification, where we can bring some of the earliest benefit to our stakeholders, but also making sure that we manage the regulatory readiness of our stakeholders as we implement the new regulations in a stepwise manner. I think as I joined the meeting, there was a discussion around the fees activities. So the fees and cost model to support this activity is a key component, and we're working with the team from finance to ensure we're developing the fees that will be sustainable for the approach that I've described in the earlier sections. And then importantly, the underpinning digital architecture, so the systems we use to process applications. We've already implemented some short-term improvements that help reporting activities, for example, which ensures that we're managing performance very carefully, but also the medium to longer term work that will help support a much more streamlined process for people submitting information to the agency, but also so that they can get timely updates on the progress of trials. And our communication strategy evolving from that of the summer to one that's looking to the future and the ambitions that we set out in this paper and the benefits that will bring to stakeholders. And the board is asked to consider the two questions at the end in relation to ongoing performance, but also the assurance provided by these high-level plans for the future of clinical trial regulation at the MHRA. Certainly be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thanks, James. That was very comprehensive. Questions or comments for James? Mandy.
Oh, thank you, James. I think that's a really comprehensive paper, and I think really encouraged to see how we're building on the experience of the summer. I know it was painful, but I think that's really positive, really positive. I was just looking at the section on the new approach, the clinical trial life cycle package, which I think is...
This is 6.9, isn't it?
6.9, 6.10. For innovators, that's probably their biggest question, particularly if they've only worked in preclinical, about how they get that passage through. ILAP promised to do that to some extent with the TDP. So I'm really interested to see how those two things work together. Because we've perhaps struggled a little bit with our ILAP process, but we mustn't repeat. So just could you give some assurance about how that will work? Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think the beauty of the design, and certainly I want to pay credit to Dr. Andrea Manfrin and team, who's our Deputy Director for Clinical Investigations in Trials, who developed the concept working with some of those stakeholder workshops that I referenced to the end of last year, is it can very much complement and integrate into ILAP in terms of both what you could feature within a TDP, but also whether it's something that is standalone and hasn't necessarily gone through the innovation passport process, for example, for the ILAP process itself. So I don't see it as exclusive. I see it as complementary, but also can be integrated into that approach as well. I don't know whether comments from
TDP is the Target Development Profile, is that right?
Yep.
Just to add to that, yes, the two teams have worked very closely on this. The integration is at two levels. As James has said, not everything that coming through would necessarily need an IP, but could benefit from this clinical trials. And also the advice upstream, which is also mentioned in the paper in 611, I think, is also tailored to link with the ILAP team so that we can see what's coming through all the different routes from the advice and then make sure we're offering the best service for the customer. We do anticipate that we'll continue to reform this. This paper puts forward a series of reforms for clinical trials. We would want the TDP and ILAP to update to reflect that so that people are getting the best possible advice and the most timely advice.
Okay, thanks, Mark and James. That's reassuring because I think this is fundamental. Probably answers a lot of the questions that the target development profile people were struggling with. If that becomes the core and that builds into ILAP, I think that's good. Thank you.
Sounds like that. Okay, Junaid.
So Mark and James, thank you very much. I suppose this seems to be a story of kind of a perform and transform at the same time a little bit, and my concern would be that we don't lose sight on the continual performance. So we probably still need to maintain a grip on all the clinical trials that are still coming through because we don't have a chance to stop, pause, build new, and then carry on. And I see that we've front-loaded a lot of work in kind of quarter 4, right? And then I just suppose, have we given ourselves enough slippage to make sure that we're set up for success moving forward? Because there's quite a lot that you need to do in terms of skills, capability building, transforming the operating model, etc. And so one request is we just maintain continual grip on clinical trial activity. We don't see that slipping and continue to review performance on that. And then just ensuring also, maybe as a question, what are the key risks to your delivery model over the next 2 quarters? What are the key things that will not set this up for success if we don't get it right?
So maybe Mark and James, I mean, I guess we're looking at page 10 particularly, but do you want to just comment on that?
Certainly. Yes, you're absolutely right. The key thing is to continually deliver. As the paper shows, we have daily applications first from initials and amendments. They're large numbers. The team is focused on maintaining that service, but we are effectively improving as we go along to bring it in there. So there's inevitable some slippage. James can comment on it in the morning. There are risks, but everything is structured around delivering the statutory function so that we keep trials flowing productively. James, I don't know if you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's a very valid concern to raise. So firstly, in terms of performance, there are still twice weekly performance review meetings happening, and we are tracking every single application, be it an initial or an amendment that is coming through our pipeline, and making sure we're clear about performing the assessments within statutory timeframes. I think very much proud of the team's work to have got performance into the space it's in now since September. However, we are not resting on our laurels, and we are keeping an absolute laser focus on ensuring that we don't have any drift of performance. To the point around delivery of the future work, very much the plan is phased. So some of the important part I talked around assessment and notification is front-loaded, and there are some important activities we need to complete over Q4 of this year, to enable those to be put in place. But we're very much prioritising those as opposed to trying to do everything simultaneously. There is a full programme management piece wrapped around this, including the risk management elements, and that's certainly something we're tracking through a regular weekly meeting. So we're tracking both operational performance, but we also have a team that's tracking how we're developing the future regulations and future operating model. Some of those key risks will always be around the resources and our people. We keep a very close monitor on the incoming work levels, and if those shifted, we would need to react to it. They're consistent at the moment with those we've seen historically, so therefore we're able to allocate the resources to support the new regulation work, be it the development of the assessment and notification schemes, but also the important work that will follow on to co-create the guidance that will support the new legislation as we move towards laying the SLI and preparing for readiness for stakeholders to adopt that. So we're very much conscious of those concerns, and we're being very active in their management.
Okay. Got lots of hands. Who wants to come back on that? Catherine, did you want to?
It's really encouraging to hear how closely all aspects are being monitored. With the information you've got at present, are you confident that the process changes will go far enough? Will they enable you to maintain performance, or do you think further changes will be needed in future?
So I think that's the critical question. And so the workshop that I referenced on the 29th of January that will be held with stakeholders from across the different phases of trials and the different communities, as well as commercial and non-commercial trial sponsors, will be really important in terms of challenging and validating the criteria that we've developed to date for notification. So the paper talks around some nominal percentages of what we believe from our workshops at the end of last year of the total volume of trials that could be processed as a notification, and obviously that would release the resources that is currently doing assessment on that to focus on higher risk activity, but also those innovation enabling aspects around the clinical trial lifecycle package and scientific advice. So I think that's the really important step. We do need to make sure those numbers are validated and that they're very solid. And certainly if we need to then reiterate any of the capacity model based on those numbers shifting, based on the outcomes of those workshops, then we'll make sure that we do that so there's still sufficient capacity to maintain the level of throughput that we need to do.
Just on a small thing, I think personally I'd find it helpful when it comes to board if the data in figure 1 is broken down by month. I think one of the lessons we had is that we didn't pick up changes early enough, and aggregating it too much can be a problem. So when it comes back, if we can have that, that'd be great. Lots of hands. I don't know how to prioritise, but Paul, I think you were first, and then.
Yeah, I mean, arguably, one of the biggest problems of clinical trials actually is post-approval and the executing them and recruiting patients in a timely fashion, with also a big sort of patient fairness to an access issue. So it's a great hope with Sprint. So sort of just coming back to a slightly earlier discussion, what's happened to Sprint and where does that sit with regards to digital trials? And he was picking up one of the, I think, really important O'Shaughnessy recommendations on the public consultation on direct-to-patient information about trials.
I might need to pass this to Mark in terms of the lead around O'Shaughnessy review, if that's okay, Mark.
Certainly. So on O'Shaughnessy, we are in regular contact with the team. In fact, a large number of meetings over the past week. We effectively, Paul, we support where we can whilst focusing on two key areas of the O'Shaughnessy recommendations. One is the 60-day review, which is making sure that we are hitting all the statutory limits. The second is making sure that we're feeding appropriate information into the system, what's called the dashboard model, so that the flow throughout the system, including recruitment, centres, etc., can be monitored centrally by the DHSC. Now, those systems are still under development and we're still improving. So there is going to be a lot of to and fro over the O'Shaughnessy recommendations over the next few months. But we are very much embedded in those discussions.
Glenn, did you want to?
Yep, happy to. Just a couple of questions and one observation. In 620, it says capacity and capability. I noted what you just said, James and Mark, on the FTEs, but that section focuses on primarily capability and doesn't really address the capacity issue. And I realize the workshops running this month. You said a full assessment's been done. So from an assurance perspective for the board, I think it'd be good to see that model and see the numbers and see how they map against the activity. So just, is there any extra assurance you can give is the first question. Second one is about advice. And are we matching our advice to our statutory function in clinical trials? I appreciate there's a balance to be had about how engaging intellectually and scientifically upstream, but that has a resource implication. So if we do more than we should do at safety and safeguarding, which is our primary function, are we then removing time to address the applications themselves that are not notifications? And that comes back to the capacity question. And final observation on the changes to the phasing, we've been involved in those. Just a flag to say we need to bring the system with us. They could domino a few things into the system, including funding and policy and international setting as well. So just those two questions on assurance, on the advice being monitored and tailored to our function, and the capacity model.
Do you want to pick that up?
So number one, absolutely there is detailed capacity planning, which is built on one, some of the assumptions around the volumes and what will be assessed and notified. And secondly, productivity data per assessor, per discipline that we've developed over the course of the last 6 months that we believe is robust and reliable. Those numbers obviously move if we change the dial in terms of what number of notifications or assessments, what's the proportion between the two, hence why they may need to iterate. But that detail certainly does sit behind that paper, and if sharing in a suitable format would be helpful, then I'm sure we could prepare something. The second point around upstream scientific advice is very much agree that it's important that it complements our role, a statutory role, ensuring the safety of patients and the approval of clinical trials. Very much what we expect to happen to this is, one, that we will streamline the assessment, because actually things coming in will be ready to go. We will reduce the number of grounds for non-approval. So that benefits the sponsor because we're not having to go back to them with issues with the application. But it also benefits us because it means we can start to drive our productivity up because we're not having to raise those number of GNAs. And from a compliance perspective, one of the aspects of the model is how we build in compliance checks in the early stages. So when we are doing scientific advice, as opposed to waiting for an inspection to occur on a trial site. So by working upstream, we avoid any issues potentially from a compliance perspective, so the compliance readiness being built in. So I think it very strongly supports our statutory function and complements what we're trying to do here, which is to safely approve trials in a timely fashion and reducing the issues up front before it even gets to assessment.
Just related, can I ask a question about people? So We know that there was redeployment to help with this, so it'd be useful to get an update of what's happened to that, because I think the plan was for people to be back by now. And related to that as well, you were using external accessors through MHRA links and so forth. Is that still part of the process, and what sort of scale is that happening at?
So in terms of internal redeployment, that has been reduced in a phased manner. It's now a very small number of approximately 4 FTEs who are continuing to support clinical trials, but that will be reduced stepwise before the end of March as we onboard a number of new medics that we've been training since the end of last year. Similarly, where we've made use of support from external partners, that will be reducing stepwise through the course of March as well. So we'll conclude by the end of March. And the numbers of staff trained that we will have in place by the end of March will enable us to meet the capacity demands for the assessment of clinical trials. And that's obviously ahead of the new regulations coming in and the changes for notifications. In terms of the partnership we developed with the NIHR to support clinical trial assessment, that's something we're keen to have further follow-up with our NIHR colleagues to understand how that can support our work in the longer term, both to the benefit of the organisation, MHRA, but also to the benefit of those from NIHR who participated and was able to provide a development opportunity for the wider system about how we all together ensure the safety of clinical trials.
So in fact, that redeployment's lasted a bit longer than we thought it was going to, I think, hasn't it? But that's helpful to know. Mercy, sorry, you've been very patient.
Yeah, that's fine. I've got 2 questions, really. Really just to make sure that in your stakeholder engagement, it involves research, charities and patient organisations. So just a reassurance on that. And just as you've got a new process coming through, and obviously new people that you're kind of involving as you work through to sustainability, that you have that you're developing detailed process manuals, so that obviously as we're engaging kind of new staff, but also external people as we've been bringing in through NIHR and other places, get a real grip on the new way of doing things, really.
So on the first point, I can very much reassure you that the stakeholder group that we initially formed back in November is representative of those communities, but also all the communities involved in clinical trials activity, and the subgroups that will be formed to focus on the co-creation of guidance to support the legislation, as well as the workshop we have coming up on the 29th, will also be sufficiently representative. That's something that is tremendously important to us as an agency, that it is representative and we involve all of those stakeholders so that their voice is part and parcel of our future regulation of clinical trials. So hopefully I can reassure you on that point. On the second point, the team do have an up-to-date quality management system that reflects the changes that were adopted over the summer. And with thanks to the delivery group of the agency, we've brought in change management specialists who will be supporting the development of the new elements of the QMS, but also the training that will be required internally, but also to support the important readiness for external stakeholders, so the training they will need about the new processes that we'll be adopting as well. So that's something that's very much captured on our risk registers around this project and on the plan going forward.
Raj.
Thank you, Chair. I firstly want to congratulate James and Mark on the phenomenal work and effort that has got us here, because it wasn't that long ago we were talking about backlogs, and to be where we are, we've caught up with the backlogs as I understand, and we're delivering to our statutory timelines. And I think I also heard you say, Mark, we're exceeding some of those timelines. Did I hear that right?
Typically, the timeline for an initial, for instance, statutory limit is 30 days. We're bringing these in round about 14 days. It's technically not exceeding, but as you can see, it's clearly much less than the statutory limit.
So congratulations, well done. I think it's a lot of hard work. It was no mean feat. I just want to build on what you had mentioned on the capacity and people piece. I think one of the unintended outcomes of looking at clinical trials and making sure we put in the right amount of resource was a knock-on effect on ILAP, for example. I think a couple of months ago, we knew there was some impact on ILAP. Could we just make sure then that those areas where we weren't, the unintended outcome domains get looked at again. I just so that we don't land back in this situation, not with clinical trials, but any of the other areas. So that I think that would be an ask just to make sure. I think a quick check on that would be good. The second thing is, as I'm looking at clinical trials and how we're moving forward this in terms of the O'Shaughnessy report, it is directly connected to ILAP in many ways. You can't take away clinical trials from an innovative regulatory pathway. They all feed in, and also potentially could connect also with the IRP, which is the next topic we will discuss. Might be worthwhile.
Sorry to interrupt. I've got a request online that we spell out the acronyms.
Oh,
so.
right. Okay.
So IRP.
IRP is the International Recognition Procedure. Is that correct, Glenn? Yeah. So it may. I think it's going to be connected in the long term because clinical trials feed the registration and the regulatory procedure. It might be useful for some future date board discussion just to look at all of these three areas, just to make sure there are no pockets of opportunity we're likely not to have picked up, because there might be pockets of opportunities, but also potentially areas of lookouts, because we are looking at this in linear form, but actually in essence, for a developer, this will be a longitudinal approach. They all feed into one another. So it'd be good to look at that, because I'm going to suspect there are some opportunities there that we should, could come to light. So just a suggestion there. Thank you.
Yeah, important points. Who want to come back on that, Mark?
Certainly. So first of all, you're absolutely right. We are very much aware as an agency of, let's say, knock-on effects. We redeployed a lot of staff to clear the clinical trials backlog, and as you've heard, the vast majority of them are now back. So we monitor that through the Delivery and Performance Committee, and that then reports very regularly to EXCO. And it's very much an active discussion of balancing these various areas. So we look to maintain the balance, but also coming out of this is the process change. Most of the process change we've brought in effectively to use our resources much more efficiently, make sure that we're meeting the customer need much more efficiently, and that's happening across the board. So it's really quite a large program the agency is undertaking at the moment to meet that. Then your second point, which is looking at the interlinkages. So we talked about the innovative licensing and access pathway. We've talked about scientific advice more widely out there, and of course clinical trials advice, and it's wider than that. We do very much understand that in creating this level of innovation and regulation, we are creating a huge number of opportunities, and we're looking to keep that across views to make sure that we are generating value. And I also support your suggestion that we come back to that at a later date, looking at that interlinkages.
So can I ask when we'll do that and how we'll do that? So is that something that will be part of a regular report to board, or do we need a deep dive? Michael.
This may help. I don't know. James, what I would echo what everybody else said. Very impressed by what you've done here. I am led, though, that all your language suggests to me is that what we've got here is a prototype about how we will do clinical trials in the future. It's not yet in a fully stable position for various reasons beyond your control. For me personally, I don't want to take the role of the executive, but I would welcome a document, a paper, probably March, April, that is a bit more what I would say operationally focused. So the things I'm interested in is, have you got a clearly defined budget for clinical trials? How is that supported by the right level of skills and people? How does that match to demand estimation for the next 12 months and beyond? And I think that's the sort of thing that we need to be visible to this board if industry and the wider public sector are going to get confidence that the MHRA is now a regulator to do business with. And I'm not criticising any of this, but it seems to me a lot of statement of intent, and I want a bit more evidence that this is actually really embedded within the organisation and is sustainable.
James, you want to?
Absolutely. So what sits behind this paper, and perhaps that's a reflection about the detail that we can include in the paper in the future, is all of that work has been done. The capacity planning, what we need from productivity, what types, numbers of FTEs of different scientific disciplines are required to deliver it, how does that map across assessment, notification, scientific advice, upstream support, and the budget workup for that is now flowing into the future financial planning. So certainly by March, we can even expand on that level of detail. As I mentioned before, that January 29th workshop will be very important in terms of defining criteria, because that almost plays through into the numbers that then feed the capacity model, that then feed the budget setting. So certainly I think we're very happy to come back in March or potentially earlier to bring that level of additional detail and scrutiny that would support the board's assurance of what we're planning to do. Just to go back to one of the earlier points as well, certainly I'm very grateful for the feedback on what we've achieved over the last 6 months. Certainly want to put all the credit for that to our assessors who have worked tirelessly and with absolute professional dedication to ensure the safety of patients, but also to make sure that we return to operational performance. I know for all of them individually, they took that very seriously and they are continuing to work incredibly hard. So I would like to thank them. And then just, sorry, one of the earlier points you raised around so the international element. Certainly the team have very close bilateral relations with many regulators, and we do have active discussions at some of those international fora that I mentioned before, ICMRA, so the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, and Access, so that is the consortia, Australia, Canada, Switzerland, Singapore. There are active discussions with partners there about how we can work together in the future as well. Premature to launch into the detail at the moment, but certainly as those discussions develop, I'm sure we could come back with further detail of that. And certainly our aspiration is to work very closely with international partners. We know significant preventative trials are now multinational, multi-centre trials. So ensuring that alignment and collaboration between regulators is incredibly important going forward. So that is something that's certainly part of the future plan as well.
Okay, just the last question for me is on the notifications. Then, I guess there's a question about how you calibrate the level of notifications. So can you just talk a little bit about how you're looking at that, and so that we have the assurance that that's a safe process that's being monitored?
Absolutely. So the existing notification scheme, or the new notification scheme we launched in October of last year, the criteria for that were developed by our experts, and then we also sought the advice of the Commission on Human Medicine, so the independent expert advisors to the agency. First and foremost, patient safety is paramount in the development of those criteria, but then also ensuring that we are being proportionate in the level of assessment we undertake. If we take unnecessarily long to undertake an assessment, that is also having a negative effect on the patient. So making sure patients are safe, but also that we push them through the approval process as swiftly as we can once we've got that level of assurance. Those criteria were a starting point. They weren't the end of the story by any means. And in the follow-up workshops we held towards the end of last year, it was clear from feedback from the community of stakeholders, be that the academic clinical community or industry, that there were opportunities to further develop those criteria safely and with an evidence base to support. So that workshop on the 29th is very much focused around that. Our internal team are currently developing and designing that workshop to make sure that all of the proposals that come out of it around being able to expand that notification scheme are safe and evidence-based and fully justified, and that we can then safely implement to the benefit of patients. We know that some of our international partners run similar and in some cases more expansive notification schemes for clinical trials, and we are engaging bilaterally with those partners to further understand the approaches and justifications they've used. So I want to reassure that safety is the first and foremost thought throughout all of this, but we do want to ensure that we maximise the use of a notification scheme where it's safe to do so, because of the benefit that also brings to patients by accelerating trial approval.
Great, thank you. I think probably we'll move on at that point, but that's very helpful. And again, to sort of on behalf of the board, to thank everybody for the work. Andrea, you mentioned, and the assessors too, but also to note some of the areas where I think it would be helpful to have something coming back with a bit more of that operational detail, which I think we've touched on in some detail. So that's very helpful. Thank you. We'll move on if that's okay. So item 7 is questions about IRP, so our international recognition. Julian, you're going to introduce the paper, I think. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So looking at the IRP, international recognition process, So as June mentioned earlier, we've introduced this from the 1st of January this year. The procedure operates with recognising decisions from our trusted partners with the FDA, Health Canada, TGA, PMDA, HSA, Swissmedic, along with
There's a lot of acronyms there, Jim.
Yeah. So America, Canada, Australia, Japan, Singapore, Switzerland, and the EU. So the different countries. Apologies for the acronyms. So this obviously forms the replacement for the previous Reliance procedures that we had following the transition of the legal status of medicines in the UK after exiting the EU. So this is looking at now supplementing our existing national route and the collaboration work that we do through the Access Consortium and Orbis. So really the paper is looking to understand the overall process so that we will have a route A and a route B procedure coming into the UK. So a 60-day timetable where certain criteria will be met. So a reference regulator approval within the previous 2 years, and for a positive CHMP particular opinion or a MRDC positive end of procedure would be satisfying those criteria. Recognition B, the 110-day timetable. This is where there would be an application with the reference regulator within the previous 10 years. There would be the potential for orphan status, ATMP, or where there's one manufacturing site which is not yet GMP certified. Equally, one of the main differences between recognition A and recognition B would be where a reference management or risk management plan has not been assessed by the reference regulator, or whether it has been. So those would be a key distinguishing feature. So as we go through the key activities, so in collaboration very much with partnerships, so working together, we have been running sessions with a trusted advisor group, looking at how do we develop the procedure going through 2023. We have then been looking at running webinars to update on practices following the various guidance launches in 2023. Externally, then we have published those guidances, and we've also published a eligibility checker form, which is available on our website, that people can then fill those out to determine whether it would be eligible for Route A or Route B. So internally, we have been doing a significant amount of effort in terms of training assessors and also the lifecycle management staff, where we're making sure that they are familiar with the new process, the procedure. We have also been recruiting additional staff, as well as a new head of international recognition, who will start on the 1st of February. In the interim, we have set up a triage management group looking at applications that would be received to understand and make real-time decisions on confirming the eligibility criteria that would come in 6 weeks before an application would be received, which is requested. And obviously, if companies have a question around that and linking into the process, we are happy to have conversations with companies to enable that process to happen. So we have been looking at a number of challenges, so that how do we move existing applications, how do we set fees, so that looking at making sure that our existing approaches, that for fees that we will not be changing existing fees, but we will be monitoring over the 3-month period to then review that in practice in times for the alignment with the new fee regulation and consultation that will be going on. It is recognised that for any new process that there may be iterations required, and we've been very open and active with that within the industry webinars to say that as we evolve more knowledge, we will grow and update the guidance as needed, hopefully to simplify, but again with the main aim of delivering on our quality, safety and efficacy requirements. And then lastly, before I open for any questions that people may have, it will be a challenge to maintain the right balance between reliance or recognition procedures and the national application process. So that will be an ongoing view for the strategy for the MHRA. But thank you.
Great, thank you. And thank you for updating us. I mean, I think it's good to see it started on the 1st of January. I think it was a pretty short timeline to get this going, so that's great to see. And there's a lot of detail here. So comments or questions from the board? Raj.
Thank you. Again, I think it's good to see this happening after all the prep that's been going on. Couple of areas. As looking at the paper, you're recruiting people into positions, so that's ongoing to be able to go. Have you got any insight into working with industry to be able to forecast what's likely to come in the next 6 months, to ensure you've got the capacity and the capability in place?
So part of the pipeline planning that we've been doing, as I referenced earlier, is to try to understand what we expect for applications to be coming in under the IRP process. We do see the levels of application for respectively innovative medicines and established medicines being broadly similar in terms of numbers, and that is our forecast going forward. We did see a slight elevation in the numbers of applications prior to Christmas as the previous reliance procedure closed out. As we go forward, we're looking at that and tracking that, and we are resourcing for the process to the numbers of applications that we have expected to see. So, and we are looking at that. There will be some slight differences because we have the Route A and Route B procedure, so the route that split will also be critical for us, so in addition to the split between national and IRP process, so that we do see a number, but broadly we're asking industry and we are linking out to get that future cast.
It'll be good to have that insight, because the risk is because you're evolving on this and you've just kicked it off on the 1st of January, that to make sure that you can then deliver within the statutory timelines on the pipeline of work that's going to come in, so that you're monitoring both and making sure. I think the risk is always when you're kicking off a new procedure like this is the volume, right? Because if that volume in any way is unexpected, then your capacity and capability, because they go hand in hand, may not be aligned, and you could run a risk.
I was going to ask, so I mean, I guess we did sort of have concern theoretically that there might be a big surge in applications, which I don't think has yet emerged. Do we think that do we have a sense from industry as to how they want to approach this? Is there a sense that they want to sort of watch a bit, or do we expect that there will be quite a sudden increase once the?
I think that people are preparing applications as we are at the moment. We're in discussions with a limited number of companies regarding eligibility forms, and I see that this will be growing, so that there wasn't a day one rush for applications being submitted to it. But we do see this from the evidence that we're talking about over the last 2 or so weeks, that this will track toward the end of January and then potentially start increasing from that point further on from where we are at this point.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a lookout, because we don't want to end in a situation where we end up with a backlog on something that we're going. May not happen, but I think you need to be just cognizant of it. And maybe even just poll to see this expression of interest or anything from industry. That they don't need to be obligated on it, but you'll get a rough idea.
And that's just to reassure you, that is something that we are absolutely doing in terms of monitoring the questions that we have coming in, the eligibility checker at least 6 weeks before, and offering question and advice service through the recognition mailbox that we have, and we are absolutely tracking that on at least 3 times a week when we have the triage meeting, to ensure that we are predicting that. And first and foremost, it is our priority to ensure that we deliver against regulatory timeframes going forward, and that absolutely is where we're focused.
Linked to that question, what I didn't see in the paper, and this might be intended, just not at this point visible, is given it's the new launch and there will be lots of learnings on both sides, is there any plan here to strategically have a pilot or working closely with the smaller companies so that you learn and share, because both parties will have to learn on this, the applicant as well as the agency, because it's the first time for us in many of these areas. I didn't see it in the paper, but I just wondered whether that thinking was there or not.
That thinking is there, so that we have said that we will be looking at doing further webinars to share learnings, to share application questions that are coming through. And that was the commitment we made on the 29th of November as well, within the webinar that was previously.
Yeah, I was thinking a bit more, just to finish it off, not so much webinars because those are like public, but actually working actively with the first 2 or 3 coming in, so that it's a collaboration of learning on both parties. Then that can be shared, in a wider piece. Just a thought, because I know other agencies do that as a sort under the title of a sort of not pilot, but first run case. So just to. I think will facilitate success for all parties if we take a collaborative approach.
Thank you for the suggestion.
Okay. Sinead?
Just a mini build, I think, on what Raj was saying. I wonder if some of the same stakeholders that you might be dealing with, Julian, on this might also be some of the stakeholders that are coming on the 29th of January to the King's Fund event, if there are industry participants. And an active dialogue with industry, transparent, regular communications is probably going to be really, really important to ensure that there's both good engagement and we're mitigating risk. And I just wondered if there's an opportunity to join up activity beyond the webinars and ensure regular proactive communications with external groups. And I don't know if groups like the ABPI or others could also be helpful to us in that process.
I don't know if Julian wants to come back or Glenn comment.
Yeah, I can kick off. Just to reassure you, I think, because we don't talk about it very often, we have a lot of contact with our trade association colleagues and individual companies on a really broad range of topics, CTs being one, backlogs being others. So I think the answer is yes, we already do it, and we have a few fora where we can actually raise this as specific items, and we often do that in collaboration with the trade associations or companies. We range from having large UK-wide international fora down to trusted advisor groups of just a handful of individuals and organisations. So if we need to collaborate, co-design, co-produce, we certainly have the contact points to do it. So I'm not concerned about that. And HQA colleagues are front and centre on that.
Okay. Sorry, Mercy here.
Yes, slightly different topic, really about safety and surveillance going forward and kind of monitoring what comes through this route. I think that's quite important. So have you had some thoughts on that? Obviously, you've been training staff together, but because it's about that reassurance that this route is not, we're not coming up with more issues or problems later on.
No, absolutely. This has been developed as a cross-agency approach. So safety and surveillance are part of our triage group as well, and the licenses that are granted are national licenses. So that's where the RMP, the risk management plan, is absolutely critical in that approval process. And that is in part drives the definition between Route A and Route B to ensure that we have the appropriate surveillance of the medicines which are approved. So that obviously, with all of the discussions that goes on, that forms part of our core remit to ensure the process is adequate to deliver on our safety, quality, and efficacy mandate.
And then there's ongoing, obviously, monitoring of that as well. Yeah.
Correct.
I recall one of the discussions we had before about this was the potential for sharing unredacted data between regulators. Is there any update on what progress with that?
So the use of redaction is something that we have and we are accepting, so that where we need to ask questions, we are looking at ensuring that we have clear, transparent routes to decision, so that information is in our records. So, and that has been updated in the guidance, so that where we are able to facilitate that, and that was one of the learnings that we had prior to Christmas, well, in December, to make sure that we were working through, so taking on Raj's point around some worked examples, so that where we were working through with companies in terms of our route of assessment of certain activities, that's something that we were taking on board.
Okay. Paul, last comment, and then we'll...
Yeah, just a question on Japan, actually, and reflections on the pharmacogenomic differences there may be, and also societal, given their BMI average is 21, 22, which is quite different to here.
MI?
Fatness.
Oh, BMI, sorry.
So, as with all of the applications, the clinical data needs to reflect the population for the license, and that's one of the requirements that we will be looking in to ensure that's satisfied as part of that IRP application. So, which is part of the reasons why Recognition B has the extended time frame, so that we can then look at through a number of points, that being one, and others, to ensure that we have got a clarity of decision for that data coming into the UK.
Great. Okay. I mean, I think that's really helpful, and I guess we're in the foothills of this at the moment. I suppose my question is, what point should we get something to the board where we're looking at how things are going, how it's changing, what evolution there is, and what the uptake has been like, the experience of industry and so forth? What would be the good timing to do that?
I mean, I don't know if others have got comments, but I'd be happy to bring something back in, say, 3 months, maybe 6 months, just to see what.
I would have thought sooner rather than later might be good.
Okay.
So April-ish, we can come back. We can think about the specifics, but I think having that assurance would be quite helpful as to how things are going. Unless anyone disagrees. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Good. Let's move on. So I think we're on to assurance papers from the boards. So item 8 is from Mercy in relation to PSEC. So over to you, Mercy. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So PSEC met on the, that's Patient Safety and Engagement Committee, met on the 7th of November. We had 2 substantive points on the agenda. One was we're monitoring the patient involvement strategy, and we had a discussion really about how it was being implemented. There were a number of issues that kind of arose. I think the committee particularly wanted to see more case studies, and using that as well to demonstrate the kind of work that the MHRA are doing around patient engagement. And the other, we spent quite some time really talking about how we get diversity of lay members involved in different areas of the work of the MHRA. And how we really kind of compensate people for that, particularly thinking about the diversity of applicants, because we're aware that the kind of people that we want come from many different backgrounds. So they might be working, they might not be working, they might be having career responsibilities and other things. And having a diverse number of views is really important, depending on the kind of work that we want patient and public involvement engaged in. So that was one deep dive. The other was CPRD's new research data governance process, which has come to the committee before. And that was really reviewing how that was working and looking again at the criteria used to speed up, I think, the process of internal and external validation of those things. Yes, so it was those 2 deep dives really on PSEC.
Great. Thanks, Mercy. Questions for Mercy? Oh, everyone's happy. Okay. Right, well, move on. Thank you, Mercy. That's great. So the next, what's coming up on your agenda? You've got a couple of things that we've discussed in terms of priorities, but the next meeting, you'll focus on what?
I knew you were going to ask me that.
Just to warn others, that will also be the question.
Yes, yes, we've got a number of. Yes, it is. The agenda will be coming out soon. We do have a forward plan that's I think all the papers have been commissioned, haven't they? And maybe, Carly, do you remember what's on
We've
the
got the
next
patient
committee?
information leaflet work, and
Yeah. That's on the electronic patient information leaflet. I think that's coming up.
That's right. I'm just trying to remember what the other
okay,
actions
no,
are. But I know
we can come back to it. That's
We
fine.
can come
All right,
back to
thank
it.
you. That's,
Thank
that's
you.
what happens if you don't get questions. Great, thank you, Mercy. So that's noted for assurance, and so let's go on to Michael in terms of ARAC. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll take the paper as read, but just 3 points I would highlight. First is, as an audit committee, we are very dependent on the work of internal audit to provide the committee and June as accounting officer assurance around governance. So we took 5 papers at our last meeting, 5 completed reports at our last meeting on the 1st of December. I just want to highlight 2 really good results. So medical devices incident reporting got substantial assurance, and that's a really good result. So, pay tribute to Alison, who's not here today, and her team, and also the preparation for international recognition. The work that had gone into that internal audit awarded moderate assurance, which again is good and reflects well on Glenn's team and the work that was done. Going forward on internal audit, we received assurance that they will be in a position to complete all of their programme to provide the annual assurance to June for the financial year ending the 31st of March 2024. Colleagues may remember that last year, that for overall assurance, internal audit rated the agency's internal controls. They gave it a limited assurance. So what we're trying to do, working with the executive, is get to a better position for this current financial year, and that work is underway. We're mapping broadly the various activities that the agency has in place to improve assurance, and that will come to fruition for the meeting of the audit committee in April. If I go on to my second point, this really relates to cybersecurity. Claire, as Senior Responsible Officer, had ensured that this was included on the risk register at a high rating. Internal Audit have awarded a limited assurance. Cybersecurity is a really difficult one, particularly when you have a high percentage of legacy systems, which the agency does. We do want additional assurance around cybersecurity and the way in which the agency is tackling this, and we'll be reviewing this further at our meeting in February. I'm confident the agency is doing a lot of work in this space, but we just want to see how this all comes together and to understand how we will be moving forward over the next 12 to 18 months. And a lot of this improving our resilience depends largely on the implementation of Regulatory Connect and the work that is being done to invest in our digital systems. And the final area that I want to highlight is health and safety. For at a number of committee meetings now, we have highlighted this risk and the work that the agency is doing in response to recommendations that have arisen from the inspections by the Health and Safety Executive. And I probably at this point would ask Mark just to update us where we are on this, because it is a key risk, particularly relating to the work at South Mims.
Thanks, Michael. Mark, do you want to pick up?
Thank you very much, Michael. And first of all, a big thank you to ARAC for the scrutiny of this. Health and safety is a matter of constant vigilance. We have to be always looking to improve under a wide range. And as you've highlighted South Mims, but I want to make sure that it applies to all staff in all conditions. We have a lot of people travelling as well. So we have a very broad range of health and safety areas to make sure we hit compliance and actually make sure the staff are as safe as possible. At the moment, we are working through the results of an inspection of South Mims that took place on the 12th and 13th of December by the Health and Safety Executive. They focused on the animal pathogen containment facility, and there we got strong positive results on the work we're doing to bring that in line. However, we haven't yet received the full report, so there will still be actions arising. They also looked at reporting of results of any incidences, and also preparation for inspection and audits, and made a series of recommendations for both on the inspections and also looking at a particular incident, a RIDOR that had been reported, and agreeing to reinvestigate it, which is a routine thing HSE do. Now, we are waiting for those results on that. We will see, we will receive initial, we've sent data before Christmas. There have been meetings throughout, so that will be coming back. So in all, we are looking to actually act on those reports when we get them, and we will report back to ARAC when we've got it. In the meantime, we have to look very much at what we can do outside of those investigations. So ARAC has requested we look to see where health and safety objectives should be used, and my colleague Liz has been looking from that from the HR perspective. Certain of the roles within the agency will have health and safety targets on it where there is significant safety aspects. Elsewhere, we're looking to make sure that everybody receives the adequate mandatory training, and that the health and safety aspects are given sufficient management time. After that, we have overall the health and safety strategy. This is a 3-year document where the agency looks to include all of its health and safety actions, make sure we are anticipating that. That strategy has 1 year left to run, but we have started work on what is the next strategy, and we're hoping to bring to the board plans for that strategy in the coming few months.
So, Michael, do you want to, in terms of ARAC and oversight of this?
Thank you very much. Of course, we will continue to monitor this. It's the first item on every ARAC meeting agenda. I would stress the importance that we resolve this quite quickly. It is important both to the capability of the organisation at South Mims, and also, you know, as duty of care to our people within the organisation. I can say no more than this, but I look to my colleagues, Mandy and Paula. Anything you want to add on this?
No, I think we do take this very seriously, because it's reflective of the controls within the organisation on a much broader level. So I think some of those basic fundamental things, that's why we've put so much importance on it.
Yeah. Paul, anything to add? Okay. Okay, well, we look forward to seeing. So when you'll be talking about that next month, presumably we might have the report from...
We will... Our next meeting, I think, is on the 1st of February, so the board will have another opportunity at its February meeting to have a further update from ARAC as to the, you know, what's been done in this particular area.
And it'd be helpful to know if there's any updates to processes more generally that we need to be looking at in that context, I think. You mentioned cybersecurity, so Claire, do you want to comment on the audit there?
Yeah. We undertook a couple of audits, internal and external, and the reason for that was so we weren't marking our own homework, and to confirm our own findings around where we thought there were particular challenges and opportunities. So it's been really helpful in that respect. Michael mentioned there is a lot of work underway already, and a lot of work that's already been done in the cyberspace. So I think, again, as Michael referenced, it's around now adding more detail around that work and showing how it makes the agency safer and how it aligns with industry and government best practice, and a timeline and roadmap for the next 3, 6, 12, 18 months, and continuous improvement, I think, will aid that.
So when does that get looked at again in terms of...
Next month.
Oh, yeah, okay. So it'll be a continuous... Okay.
Yeah.
And did you want to comment on Regulatory Connect and the...
Yeah, so Regulatory Connect, that's amongst many things, changing ways of working and so on, but replacing legacy technology. But that's not the only area where we do have legacy, and like a lot of other public sector and private sector organisations actually. So again, we're talking about cyber in particular, but within digital and technology, our three strategic themes are around cyber, innovation and eradicating legacy. All three are linked and complement and influence each other. So this cyber work feeds into each of those themes.
Anyone else want to comment on any of those aspects? Great. Any other thoughts, Michael? If not, thank you, and I think we look forward to the next update. Great. And finally, then I think we've got an update from, is it Mandy on ODRC? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. So ODRC is the Organisational Development and Remuneration Committee, which is quite a mouthful. We have been focusing primarily on the organisational development aspect, which really comprises three areas, I suppose: people, process and technology. And we looked at all three in the meeting in December. I'll take the paper as read and just summarise on a few sort of remarks. I think we're very conscious that we've had some reputational setbacks in terms of our clinical trials and backlogs in established medicines as well. I think, as we've said earlier, the clinical trials team have done an excellent job in clearing the backlog, and there's been a lot of learning in how we can improve processes to sustain the future, which is something we've been battling with, but I think we're finally turning the corner. So I think we can give assurance on the board that I think we now get it, what process improvement means and how that manifests itself back into budgets, technology and our skills and resource planning. So the committee really encouraged the work and learning from clinical trials to be cascaded and used across all other areas where we're making process improvements, because the principles are very similar. I think it's taken us time to understand the appropriate skills and capability we need to cope with the demand for medicines and devices. And I think it's recognised that some teams were initially under-resourced. We're seeing that is less of the case now, but I think, as James said, we're now training people and getting up to strength. So I think that's encouraging. It was both for ODRC. I think we have to look about how we're more agile in the future for looking at the resourcing we need. I think the committee is still concerned that it's taking quite a long time to embed improvements to deliver services. And I know there are many reasons for that. I would say there are some green shoots, but I think there's still a little bit of underlying concern. So good work in progress. So the clinical trials work is indicating that new ways of working can be established. Our vacancies are reducing, and I think we saw a definitive plan for the release 1 of Regulatory Connect. And so that gave us greater assurance that is making progress and delivering. So I think some green shoots there. We need to keep very close eye on that. So we're still concerned to some extent. The backlog in established medicines has grown over the last year, and that is still of a concern. Hopefully there will be the ability to build off the experience with the clinical trials crisis management team, and also the more trained resources coming into the organisation and new processes, as we've understood. So I think we have the pieces there. We've still got to pull all those together to get that performance that we need going forward. And I think finally we saw encouragement in two major areas. The strategic change team, I think, is very important, having that established to really support in programme management and, as James was saying, and I think this is also for Julian as well, making change in the organisation takes time and resource and doesn't just happen. And we're also encouraged that the Leadership Development Day was very well received, and I think building on that, as Liz said, and we will be looking at that in our forward agenda, that leadership development, and also the feedback from the surveys. So any questions?
Great, no, thank you. It's a helpful summary across quite a big range of things, actually. Comments, questions? Paul?
It's really encouraging. Do you think we've got sufficient resource now, or we're getting there in terms of change management support?
I'll probably let others, the executive, answer. From the committee's view, I think we were encouraged it's getting there and it's beginning to get traction. So Mick Foy's team, the strategic change team, I think is helping. Whether we've got enough, I don't quite know, but maybe others around the table will be able to.
Anyone want to pick that up in terms of?
I think it's very appropriate to stress the model that's been followed with clinical trials, because it isn't just putting more staff in. We are a very large agency. It's about the process improvement and the technological infrastructure to that. So it is the same challenge as we've rehearsed just in the previous but one paper, that we have to really look at that process change and really get the kind of expertise and staff that is needed to make that deliver to statutory timeframes. I think with the established medicines, it's a broader challenge because it's a broader part of the life cycle of a medicine. So the principles are absolutely applicable. Your question, do we have enough resource, has to be modified by to do what, with what expertise, and that's the challenge now.
Yeah, I think you're asking about the programme management support to do that and the change management. So I think we are understanding the value of that better. That was what I felt, and so and we have recruited a team of people to help support each of the key areas.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's something that you'll closely monitor to sort of see the quanta whether we're meeting that. And if I can sort of have a follow-up question on, I was interested on learning from others, which is really important, and particularly the FDA, and just what are those learnings, and is there a sort of a way of getting ongoing insights from external organisations that have done this already successfully?
So which piece are we talking about there, sorry?
It says, encouraged to learn from the FDA's experience in rolling out new technology.
Okay. Claire?
Yeah, we have really strong relationships with FDA and other partners, so the Access Consortium and so on, and they learn from us as well. So when we've done a compare and contrast of different tech approaches and tech stacks, they're pretty consistent as well, but we're maintaining those relationships and quite regularly, and that's not just for, say, Regulatory Connect, it's around enforcement as well, and all different areas within the business.
Okay. You mentioned the established license backlog, so Julian, maybe if your voice is holding out, if I could just ask you to comment on that, because I think clearly that is an important focus at the moment, and to what extent can the lessons learned from clinical trials be brought to bear on this?
No, absolutely, and I think looking at the as commented already, is looking at process, so that we are absolutely laser focused on a new process that we're trialling at the moment. We are looking at the resources that we require, and we are looking at making sure that we have the program management capability embedded in the project as well. So that is looking at it similarly as we had that with the IRP program going through the back quarter of last year. So that is also something that is a valuable skill. It cannot be underestimated, the change of culture that we need to impose as well, so that we are making sure that we have that the appropriateness of review, making sure that we deliver the safety, quality and efficacy review of the medicines that we're looking at, but also making sure that that is in a time-bounded, very clear fashion in terms of how we are then achieving that. So that is very much front and centre of our daily lives right now, in terms of making sure, as it has been, so that we have recognised that we do need to make further changes, which we are doing, to ensure that we are delivering on reducing that backlog. So,
and I guess we've got the clinical trials work, the established license work, and that's kind of coming to address a problem that's arisen. So are there other areas that we can get ahead of in terms of change and embedding these learnings that we should be thinking about now before there's a problem? Or do you think these are the main areas?
I should pick that up, Chair. Yes, these are the areas that have come out as crises, emergencies. But there's going to be, and there's reference in the paper to a task force, a look right across all the statutory functions now to look at, are there backlogs? What percentage of procedures meet statutory timelines? And what is needed in the way of process improvement? So that's kicking off now. You've already heard a reference to our Delivery and Performance Committee, but I think the two experiences that we're talking about have given a real edge to get this done very quickly. And I'm looking to DHSC sponsor for the support and insight that we're receiving to help make sure this happens very quickly, right across the piece. Okay. So the answer isn't, oh yes, there's activity Z coming up, we've done X and Y and here's Z. No, it has to be a look right across the agency in the context of the 14 or so statutory functions we have. And that's nothing less than the public would expect, and our department.
Catherine, do you want to comment on? Not particularly. That's okay. That's fine. Just mention the department. Mandy, you got it?
Yeah, and I think that's an important message. And as we said, I did put in the paper is that there's a concern that we lurch from crisis to crisis, and I think that review across there and embedding the learning is really, really important, because we can't solve every problem with a task force because it does have knock-on effects. So I think it's very important that review where we've probably looked at our two biggest activities in terms of clinical trials and licence applications. We need to make sure there isn't something else that's going to creep up on us.
And just help me with the timeline on that review. So what do we expect?
Well, we're kicking off work that should surface the basic statistics this week. Mm-hmm. So I would have thought the board in February will have a stock take.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Good. Thank you, Mandy. Any other questions, comments on that? I think that's very helpful discussion. Great. So that's the end of our formal papers. So then we move on to questions. So as I mentioned at the start, this is a board in public, not a public meeting, but there is an opportunity to take questions from the public. I think we had 4 questions submitted in advance. We only address the questions here that are directly related to the agenda, and I think there is one that is directly related to the agenda. So Rachel, do you want to lead us through that? And then if there are other questions, please let us know.
Yeah, thanks very much. So there's one of the pre-submitted questions and 2 further questions that have come in during the meeting. So if I start with the pre-submitted one, which relates to the international recognition procedure. The questioner says this is described as an example of maximising Brexit freedoms. Please describe what freedoms the new arrangement introduces that we didn't already have, and describe what risk assessments you've conducted on them.
So Julian, are you happy to respond to that?
Absolutely. So the main change is that the medicines regulations is now under the control of the UK government, and suggestions and alterations can be made by the agency to that. And as we have put in place for the IRP, the international recognition procedure, we can make those changes as a sovereign regulator. So that is the benefit which has been achieved by that. The risk assessments that we do are very clear in terms of how we implement, how we look at the safety, quality and efficacy of those different procedures as they would come through. Yeah. And we would do treat them with the principle of the national guidances that we need to then ensure compliance. And we work very closely with international partners, for example, through the ICH Commission, so the International Commission on Harmonisation globally, to make sure that we are working and aligning our standards with our global partners.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the risk assessment, we've touched on some of those aspects in the discussions already.
Correct.
Today, I think, haven't we? Okay, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Julian. You said there's 2 more?
Yeah, so if we move on to the next one, which goes back to one of the items in the Chief Exec's report about polio vaccine. And the questioner has said that the report mentions the risk of vaccine-derived polio virus and asks how does that compare to wild polio numbers?
Okay, that's quite a specific question. Mark, do you want to come in on that?
Thank you very much, Chair. So, polio is a subject of a very significant eradication program internationally, and at this point there are known cases of wild-type polio in only 2 countries, and significant work is being done to eradicate it. So very few numbers of wild-type. The polio virus that was used to vaccinate the vast number of the population has an unfortunate rate of reverting to wild-type, and then you can see outbreaks occurring. Those can occur anywhere globally, and there's an international surveillance system, and the MHRA is very proud to participate in partnership with the UK HSA and other public health bodies in the UK to actually undergo surveillance for the people in Britain of such a situation. I don't have exact numbers to hand, but if there was such a breakout, then the object is to vaccinate anybody who might be at risk, and that is where the NOPV2 vaccine comes in. It's for strain 2, one of 3 strains of polio, and it has an extremely low rate of reverting to wild type, and I do mean exceptionally low. And as such, it's safe as a vaccination protection system to prevent further vaccine-derived outbreaks. So I hope that answers the question, and we can certainly reach for more figures if necessary.
No, I think that's very thorough. It's slightly tangential to the work of the board, but I think that's very helpful. Rachel.
Thanks. And the third question relates to the discussion on health and safety that the board has just had. And it's quite a specific question again. Does the South Mims laboratory have a level 4 SAPO trained officer? And are there arrangements in place for a SAPO 4 trained deputy? And I thought it might be useful if perhaps we could just explain what that acronym means to start that off.
I think that's back to you, Mark.
Certainly. So, SAPO4 stands for Specialised Animal Pathogens. It's a type of containment for animal diseases that have been proven or known to cross over and infect humans. So an example is avian influenza, but there are other examples. It's an extremely high level of containment requiring specialised containment facilities, trained staff, and a dedicated support system, which in this case includes a biological safety officer who is trained in understanding the nature of the animal pathogen involved, the risks, and any specific handling. We have both a trained biological safety officer and a trained deputy in place at South Mims. But just a note on the training is an ongoing process, so they will both be receiving continuous updates and training to maintain proficiency. Yes, sorry, I thought I said we have both a safety and a deputy.
Great, thank you. Rachel, anything else?
No, that concludes the questions that relate to directly to the agenda.
Great, thank you very much. And as a reminder that for those online, there is a customer experience centre for the other questions not related to the agenda. So I think that concludes our morning. So thank you very much to everybody. And at this point, we'll finish the morning meeting.